Now it's my real pleasure to introduce the next beautiful mind here, who has been associated with IIASA for a while, actually, Bill Nordhaus, who is a professor of economics at Yale. I first met him at IIASA at a workshop about climate change, and where he's, in a sense, epitomizing the thing and the fact that I think he was one of the first, if not the first, eminent economist who dealt with the climate change issue. So, Bill, you will tell us today about climate clubs, I understand.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's fair to say that IIASA has been in the forefront of global warming research for 4 decades. And what's interesting is if you look back at the beginning of that, it was actually zero, what I call zero on the intellectual Kelvin scale, that basically there was virtually nothing. But if you look at the people who've been associated with it over this period, people like Charling Koopmans, Wolf Haefele, Alan Mann, Naki Nebojša-Kačinović, Alan Murphy, Tom Schelling, you can see the kinds of minds that have gone into getting us to where we are today. Now, looking backwards, if we knew then what we know now, we'd say there are really 3 central problems that need to be addressed. One is the science, and the science, I think the science is settled. We know we know more or less where we're going. It's mainstream science, and I'm not going to talk about that. A second question, though, is in terms of controls. What kinds of instruments are we going to use? How are we going to control at a societal level in our economies the emissions, the kinds of things we were talking about, just Carla was talking about? I think it's clear that the only workable approach is what is known as carbon pricing. Put a price on carbon. There are different ways of doing it. This is what I call the inconvenient economic truth. It's still controversial in some quarters, but give it another couple of decades and I think it will be accepted. But when I talk to my political science colleagues, they say they chide me that we're missing something, that there's a missing element here, and that is how to induce international cooperation. How are we going to get countries to control, to cooperate? And I think this is a largely neglected area, and it's something I want to talk about briefly this afternoon. It's also the subject of my talk tomorrow at the joint IIASA Austrian Academy of Sciences lecture, and so those of you who want to hear the longer version can hear that tomorrow night. But I want to do a little tomorrow. I'm going to talk more about the broader terrain of the history and structure of international economic and environmental agreements. And I just want to make one single point today, and that is I want to introduce the idea of clubs. And I think the reason that we've been unsuccessful in terms of our international negotiations is we have not seen climate negotiations and climate treaties as clubs, but as some other rather confused mechanism. I won't talk about what it is because I think different people have different things in mind. Okay, so what is the idea here? The idea is I think what I'd like to do is suggest we think of treaties as clubs. That's to say they're clubs in the sense that we want what is a club? A club is an agreement where you have some kind of economy of scale. You can exclude non-members to avoid free riders, and there's some kind of coalition stability. There are actually, if you look around, there are lots and lots of clubs. The EU is one of the great clubs of the world. Citizens of nations, you're members of clubs, employees of firms. Free trade agreements are clubs. There are sports clubs as well. And the central point about clubs is there's something you want to join, but you have to pay dues. And in the case of climate treaties, what I'll suggest is there are going to be some benefits of being in the climate club. You have to pay the dues. The dues are your abatement. But what we have to figure out is what are the benefits of joining. Now, I'll put up here a slide of Kyoto because I think the Kyoto Protocol is what I'll call a failed club. And if you look at the top line there, that shows the share of global emissions that were covered by the Kyoto Protocol. I extrapolated that 1 year to next year when it goes to 0. The EU is there. But what you can see is that the Kyoto Protocol attracted no people to join it. Countries dropped out. And in the end of the day, it was not extended. So what you really need to think of is a kind of club that would be attractive for climate. Now, here's just 3 examples of clubs. There's no club on the left. There's a weak club, which has 2 members in the middle, and that you can think of that as the Kyoto Protocol, as something with a couple of members, but most of the people out of it. And really what you need to do is think of a strong club. Now, I'm not going to go through in detail. What I want to suggest is the way to think of a climate club, I'll talk again more about this tomorrow, is there have to be some membership dues. And what I would suggest is the kinds of dues that you would need is something like part of a trade agreement, where if you're part of a climate club, you're part of a free trade agreement, and if you're outside of the climate club, then you have duties on your imports. Now, this is actually sounds like a rather radical idea. At least to economists, it's a rather radical idea, because economists are very attached to free trade, and this looks like rolling back the tide of free trade. But in fact, it's probably the only mechanism where that I can think of anyway, where you could actually set up a club where people would want to join. So I'll just give you one picture, and then I'll close here. So this is a picture that suggests there are actually three things here. At the bottom, this shows the abatement rate on a global level. The bottom shows the red line is what you call a non-cooperative agreement. People would do some abatement just because it will affect themselves. At the top of the green line is a cooperative level, which these are just illustrative numbers, but might be in the short run, say 50% of emissions. And then on the horizontal axis is the club carbon price. And what the idea is, you raise the price higher and higher, you get more and more abatement. At some point you raise it too high and people drop out. So the trick is you need to find a mechanism for the club, you need to find a way of enforcing it, and it has to be a kind of club that people want to join. So I think I'll just then summarize very quickly the conclusions. I would just conclude. There's some other ones, but I'll skip those. So I think the main point I want to get across, this is really a political science point, not an economics point, it's a game theory point, that a Kyoto-type model of climate treaty is doomed to failure because of non-cooperative elements of country behavior. Countries are going to look at it and simply say, there's no reason I should do it, I'm not going to join it if I'm not in it, and I'm going to drop out if it's too expensive. The alternative is to think of a club model, and the possible club that I've suggested is a trade zone where club members put tariffs on non-participants. This is actually a very complicated mathematical problem because of the combinatorial aspects of it, and I've just shown you one example. But I think the major lesson I'd like to suggest is that you need some kind of incentive, some kind of club model if you're going to have an effective international climate agreement. Thank you.